There you go.
There we go. Hi. Hello. I'm David Kleinfelter and Hannah Cassidy. We are both from Reno and Kavanaugh, which is a firm with offices here and in D.C. and Columbia, Maryland. Anywhere else now?
It's really a DC firm, and we're focused on affordable housing and community development.
And Hannah is the managing member of the firm, so you got the big boss here, which is why I'll be doing all the talking.
David knows all about zoning, which is why you'd much rather listen to him talk than me.
But I seriously, if you have any interest in the future in law, especially real estate law, especially affordable housing law, you really got to go online, take a look at Reno and Kavanaugh. It's a unique firm. I've been there 9.5 years now, but I've been practicing law for 29 years. And it's truly a unique firm focused on building communities and building primarily affordable communities. They know everything there is to know in DC about HUD. We know a bit here, but the DC office knows everything about regulation. So I am, again, David Kleinfelter. I have been practicing law for 29 years, off and on. Been with the firm, like I said, 9.5 years. Before that, I worked at the Metro Planning Department managing the Land Development Division, which is the group that does the boring stuff in planning. We don't do the fun, sit around and design communities. We review subdivisions and zoning, as luck would have it, which is why I'm here. Before the Planning Department, I actually, for 5 years, was on the Metro Council, and the reason that's relevant is that anyone that's on any city council or Metro Council, in our case, will tell you that land use and zoning is a huge part of what you spend your time doing, because that's really the most down in the neighborhood area. That's what people care about. So I have a question for you before I get really started, and that is, how many of you, at least for now, plan on staying in Nashville after you've graduated? So a few people. So, I mean, I'll make it in the sense of an apology in that mostly what I know about zoning, of course, is focused on what I've done here in Nashville. And as with any other kind of law, it's different in different states, but the concepts are basically the same, especially what I'm going to start with. We had a little video that was kind of giving you an introduction. It's not going to work, I'm afraid, so I'm going to jump right into the history of zoning laws. And zoning is not a new thing. It's the conventional zoning that we have today. It started in around 1916, the first zoning ordinance. But in ancient days, we all know about walled cities, and the walled cities, in a sense, were zoning. The good stuff was kept inside the wall, the bad stuff was kept outside the wall. So it was inclusion, I mean, the first time of excluding people based on different zones, if you will. For modern zoning, the beginnings were the 20th century. So the country had been very rural, very it's spread out like Bonanza. Anybody know what that is? It's a TV show out in the West. But people, you know, horseback, dirt roads and everything, and we've gotten more and more dense. Industries and people were living right next to each other. And it's very different than what you're used to today, where you have a neighborhood here, a mall here, a downtown here, because it was all mixed together. And what people realized is the industrialization, you had open sewers. We didn't, of course, have sewers underground. People dumped stuff in the street, dumped it out the window. You'd have a noxious plant right next door to someone's tenement housing. And so people started saying, well, we need to separate these things. We got to separate the bad from the good. That is based on two basic principles. One is nuisance, and the other is police power. Nuisance is if I have a piece of land and you're next door to me, and I start doing something really horrible on that piece of land that limits your ability to enjoy your property, you typically have a right to sue and stop me from doing that. That's common law. Forget zoning, forget statutes. The police power then was where the government said, okay, what we're going to try and do is step in and prevent those nuisances before they occur. So if I decide we're living out in the neighborhood, and I decide I'm going to run a Harley-Davidson repair shop, and you live next door in a house, yeah, you could sue me for a nuisance, but you shouldn't, you go to court and all that. So the government said, well, we're going to separate these uses. We're going to say, these areas are good for residential, these areas are good for the commercial and the industrial. The first comprehensive zoning plan, which way is up, in America, we froze again, Professor.
Get scared.
Well, while he's doing it, it says right there anyway. The first one was in New York in 1916. That was the first major zoning ordinance that took all the uses, and again, it categorized them. We're going to get into more detail in a minute on how the uses are categorized and move around.
It did it again. It's something is not right.
It doesn't like me.
No, it's been doing this to me for 2.5 weeks. Now go ahead, just take your notes and wander about. Take your notes and wander about.
Beautiful slide.
We can't even get the slides to
I
work.
will try and reboot it while you're wandering about, enjoying the class.
A significant portion of what I'm going to say is on the slides.
I'm so sorry.
All right, so see if I can wing this without any visuals or anything. It's going to get a lot more exciting because I don't have any idea what I'm doing without the slides. So, I'm trying to remember where we were. It was talking about separation of uses in the first zoning ordinance. And then in 1926, there's what the zoning that we have all around the country, mostly now, is known as Euclidean zoning. So if you meet some land use nerd, you want to sound intelligent, ask them what they think about Euclidean zoning. And I'll tell you why, well, I'll tell you why now it is called Euclidean zoning. It's because in 1926, the Supreme Court ruled for the first time that zoning is legal. Now you may be saying, well, duh, why wouldn't zoning be legal? We've got zoning, we've always had zoning. The issue was, party owned a piece of property, and the government said, for the first, not the first time, again, 1916 in New York was the first time, that they had a zoning ordinance in Euclid, Ohio, and they told the property owner, you can't build whatever it was, and I frankly don't remember. And the property owner sued, and for years and years, if you know anything about the court system, you know it takes a long time to get to the Supreme Court. They got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, essentially, no, zoning is okay, zoning is legal. The reason that they challenged the zoning is actually the Fifth Amendment. Now, a lot of people know about the Fifth Amendment because we know the Fifth Amendment is you don't have to incriminate yourself. If you're asked questions, one can remain silent. Fifth Amendment is also what's called double jeopardy. If you've been gone to court one time on a criminal offense, they can't make you go a second time. What else is Fifth Amendment, Hannah? It's got other things in it. But it also has takings. One of the clauses in the Fifth Amendment, right up there with whether you can incriminate yourself, oddly enough, is that the government won't take private property without compensating you. So if you've ever known anyone that's had like their property taken, maybe a piece of the property for a road, government can do that. They have an absolute right to do that, called eminent domain, but they have to pay you. And so what these owners said was, you're taking my property. I want to build, let's say it was a factory. I think it was a factory. And the government said, no, you can't build a factory because your zoning doesn't allow it. And they said, no, it's private property. This is America. You can't tell us we can't do anything with my property. I can do what I want on my property. I imagine everyone's heard someone at some point say that. I know I have at planning. When I worked at Metro for 7 years, people would come in, you can't tell me what I can do on my property. The answer was, yes, you can. And the reason you can is because of Euclid v. Ohio. You can watch the blank screen. Euclid v. Ambler is what the city of Euclid v. Ambler. So the court held in that case that you can exercise the police power by having a taking. And part of the reason, and you don't have to compensate people, by the way. If I have a piece of land and it's currently zoned for single-family homes, currently zoned, say, for factories, and the government comes in and rezones it for single-family homes, well, I've lost some value there, right? Because the factory is get a lot more value than you do for homes. The government doesn't have to compensate you for that kind of a taking, though, because they're not completely taking it. Yeah, you can't build the factory anymore, but you can build a house. So that's also what the Euclid v. Ohio case says. So what the basic premise was, we can separate uses. Didn't used to separate uses. We all know what actually most urban cities still look like, but what towns and everything look like. You have everything mixed together, but you can now zone, because of Euclid, to separate uses. So what happened because of that? Well, there were a lot of unintended consequences. My favorite one to talk about is if you say we're going to separate uses, you say you're going to have a residential neighborhood, that means if you look at the zoning table, I'll show it to you later, it's got all these land uses and all these districts, and if it says residential, you can't have the Harley-Davidson shop I was talking about. But you know what you also can't have, technically, is the little old lady that teaches piano down the street. She's breaking the law. Aunt Murtis that's over doing hair in her basement or in the front porch, she's breaking the law. Nobody really expects that. Nobody intends that. It is what it is, though. And you'll occasionally have people shut things down. There are ways around it with special zoning, but it rarely happens. So early zoning is just put it here, put it here, put it here, put it here. Modern zoning has changed. There are lots of it's becoming more based on how things look, what we call form-based zoning. It's not form-based like filling out a form. I didn't realize one day people all thought I was saying, I'm going to fill out my form for zoning. Form is in blocks, how tall, how big. And if you think about it, when you go into a city or a neighborhood, you don't really care what people are doing in all those buildings. If you're experiencing that from the public area, from the streets, you're looking at it and you're experiencing what you see. And you know when you see something that looks horrible, which is a lot of suburban, strip malls or a Walmart, 10,000 parking places for one store, as opposed to when you're in a nice town or a nice city that has buildings up on the street and you can walk there and feel comfortable. So it's focused on that. Also, more modern types of zoning is known as inclusionary zoning. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, zoning is all about excluding this use here, excluding this use here. In the medieval city, you can live in the city if you're, in the town, inside the wall, or you're excluded and you're outside the wall. Inclusionary zoning is really focused mostly on affordable housing, affordability, but it is because when we take all these neighborhoods and we rezone them to 1 acre lots or half-acre lots, just as a matter of economics, you're saying that people usually, especially if they're in close to the city, you got to have a lot of money to live there. So it is excluding anyone whose economic means don't allow them to buy 40,000 square feet, it's roughly an acre, and a house. And so inclusionary zoning ordinances, and by the same token, when we build things as we're building in Nashville all over the place, these extremely high-end apartments, you're excluding people that can't afford that. An inclusionary zoning ordinance, which many, many cities have, we'll get to Nashville in a second, if you're building a certain number of market rate units, which can be expensive, you have to include X number of affordable. We're not here to talk about affordable housing, but it can be, usually it's 60% of the area median income. My daughter lives in Denver, and they have a lot of apartment buildings downtown that are gorgeous big apartment buildings. Each one of them has a few affordable units. It's not solving the world's affordability problem, but it's addressing some of it. Nashville attempted to, did we pass it and then the state overruled us? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Nashville passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance, and as is often the case in Tennessee, Nashville does a really nice law that's really good and progressive and helpful, and the state legislature says we don't like that. And because they said we're not going to make developers provide any affordable units. So point of all that is that's actually zoning, because you can zone property and say, we're not just going to talk about uses, we're going to talk about and things like including people.
Hey, David, I just want to hop in and say, in some ways, this kind of goes back to David's original point, which was, zoning is basically an exercise of the police power of the government saying, hey, we're going to step in, proactively avoid problems that will occur if we mix up all these uses. So there's that public good, but then you've got to balance that against, the impact that has on property owners who now can't do whatever they want to with their property. So it's like a balancing of interests. You've got like the public's interest in laying everything out in a way that works for the greater good, and then you've got the individual property owner's rights where they're saying, hey, but I wanted to build a factory, or hey, but I wanted to build like a luxury apartment complex. How come you're telling me that now I have to, either not have this use at all or restrict it in a certain way? So it's kind of a continuing evolution of thought in terms of balancing those interests.
Well, and it varies a lot too from community to community. In some areas, California is notorious for all these different things that they use the police power for. You have to have this and this, you have to have all these different things, you have to have, you just have a lot of stuff. The design, they really regulate it very highly. Down to other communities that have just very basic zoning, still those uses, as I said. And there are many communities still, is anyone from a very rural area, a rural community? There are some rural communities that if you still try and pass a new zoning, they may have no zoning. And when you start to pass the zoning ordinance, you'll have people show up, pitchforks and shotguns and everything at the council meeting, screaming, not really, screaming and yelling, no zoning. And I've even seen a friend of mine who used to be the planning director who had a great slide, I don't have it in there, even if it was working, that says zoning is communism. And so you just have communities that just say, it's our property, that's why we live out here in the middle of nowhere. It's because we want to be able to do whatever we want to do. So there's still communities that don't have zoning.
That's really true. I was with the Tennessee Regulatory Authority, and we used to go out and hold hearings. And we went out into a small rural community, and it was primarily Amish farmers. And the Amish came into the hearing carrying pitchforks, shovels, and axes.
So why, before we get into more of the details about zoning, why is zoning important? Now, you've got to, even before everything else quit working here on the slides, there was a video that wasn't going to work. And I believe the professor sent you a link. It's an IT problem. Sent you a link to, it was in Canvas, is that what it's called?
Canvas.
In Canvas. You've got to watch this video. This guy is hilariously negative and caustic in a fun way. I mean, think about any comedian you know who's always, complaining. That's what this guy is, basically a comedic presentation, highly intellectual presentation about zoning and how, in his opinion, he talks about how I wish I could turn phrases like he does, because he's just got a great way of saying, we've screwed up our country with the way we zone. Because at one point, he stands jokingly on the slide, he says, he's showing slides too. And he says, you're standing on the corner in front of the Walmart, you can't see the target because of the curvature of the earth, because it's so far away. And just, it talks about all these buildings, and it's very important to watch that presentation, 20 minutes, very good, because everything he's talking about, he doesn't mention zoning, he just mentioned design, but it's all based on zoning. Because, for example, in one instance, there's this long city street, long sidewalk, and there's just this ugly brick wall all the way up against the sidewalk. Zoning could have said, you got to have stoops, you got to have windows, you got to have something so that a person who's walking by there, either because they can't afford a car, because they just happen to like to walk or bike places, doesn't have to have that horrible condition. So zoning is important because of what I call, and what others call, the sense of place. What does it feel like where we live? And what does that say about us when we just have the trashy areas that, again, it's a sea of parking, and it's just not somewhere anyone wants to be.
Let me say one more thing too. So again, keep in mind, this is an evolution of a relatively new concept. So before the Industrial Revolution and all of these factories coming into being and all of these people moving into more urban areas, there was no zoning ever. Nobody had ever heard of it. So the early zoning codes, like the one in New York from from 1920, that was based on separating uses, because that's what everybody thought the public good was at the time. Like, let's keep this factory away from these houses.
I guess what led to now was actually another slide that said that the deal is, by separating all the uses, in suburbia anyway, not in cities, but in suburbia, everyone lives in their car, because you might live half a mile from the school, but you probably can't walk there, because there's no street, there's no connected street. You got to go all the way out to the highway and drive a mile and a half around in a loop to get to where you're going to school. So in lots of cities, and again, especially in suburbia, we designed, because we said all the uses have to be separated, so we said the car is king. And once we've said the car is king, we're going to put the throne, parking lot, out in the front of everything. And so we've designed these communities around the car, and we're finally realizing, because, again, these unintended consequences are that, we've increased CO2 emissions, which is proven. It's not a belief, it's a fact, a scientific fact. It's causing climate change. And if you look at a table, you will see that in the 70s, I don't know the numbers, I'm not good at remembering them, but there's a steady stream up from how many car trips per day are being taken. It's called VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. Because of zoning, because of the way we live, our vehicle miles are going up, and it's climate change. The other one is obesity. When I said this to Hannah, she didn't get it. She said, "What you said? What's that have to do with zoning?"
Multifaceted issues. So David sees the zoning relationship.
And the whole point of all this stuff is this is why
I'm passionate about this.
we're going to talk about the legal parts. But I want to make clear I'm a zoning nerd, and zoning can be interesting because it affects everything about us, everything about the way we live. And because of, again, the car dependency, because of food deserts, because of lack of healthy options, all these different things arise out of how we have zoned our communities.
Right, and so now, whereas before the emphasis was always on separating the uses, now we have these new form-based codes where people are organizing their zoning around the way the buildings are kind of designed in relation to each other, in relation to the street. You know, now instead of the emphasis being on separating all the uses, the emphasis is on creating more healthy and sustainable communities.
Right.
So more walkable, like let's make sure that people can walk around. Let's not just focus on, you know, cars and parking lots, but instead create zoning codes that actually further these new public interest goals.
In a sense, that's the future, and it's where we're headed. Depending on where, if you go somewhere again, you get into law, you get into land use, then you're going to care about that kind of zoning. But I'm going to talk about where we are at today, which is the more conventional zoning. So now we're going to get into more of the legal part. I mean, because the reason we were probably asked to be here primarily from a property law standpoint isn't the wonders of zoning, the wonders of global warming and beautiful neighborhoods. It was zoning because it affects what you can do on your property. And most lawyers looking at zoning, their focus is, I'm also a city planner and I let that override it sometimes, but most lawyers is what can I build on my lot, on my parcel, to develop it, to borrow a lot of money from a bank and build a new development. And the other is I already own it, what can I do on it? And of course that happens, that second one's more for residential especially. People say, well, I want to do this. I get calls from friends all the time. I just got one the other day, there's a garage behind my house. We bought this house, it has a garage behind it. Can I put my in-laws in there? And can they live there? The answer is no, because that zoning district only allows one living unit per lot. And so, nope, can't put the in-laws back there. You can't
Plus
put
you
it.
need to do some,
You can rezone it.
but you need to do some upgrades to the garage, I'm assuming.
They have to no, it was already there.
Oh, okay.
Somebody's probably using it illegally. We all know someone's got that. Probably half the Airbnbs in Nashville are probably not legal because you got a unit that you're not allowed to rent and someone's renting it. So, zoning from a regulatory standpoint, not from a historical, not from a why is it important, but from a regulatory standpoint. Read slide.
Does anybody have Canvas open? It's session 14F, our David's slides. You can actually open it right now. Somebody tried to open Canvas, and that's what happened.
The canvas exploded.
It exploded.
David really did do a great job with the slides.
Yeah, they're wonderful. Please go in and look at them. Right now, if you can.
Yeah.
All right. The first part of the whole zoning scheme is called the general plan. And this is pretty much universal around the country. It definitely is the case in Tennessee. In Tennessee, every community has the right. They don't have to adopt a general plan. Who wants to guess somebody guess what a general plan is? What's a general plan? I'm pointing. What's a general plan? For land, we're talking about land use. What's it for?
Broad.
Yeah, it's broad. It is a broad plan for how we're going to grow. Now, everybody says, you hear people like to complain over beer and coffee. We're not planning for anything. Well, no, we are. Most every city has a general plan. In Nashville, it's called Nashville Next. Nashville Next went through an extremely public process. It's 1,700 pages long of how we're going to grow as a city, where stuff's going to go. There were 18,500 contacts with area residents as they went through this plan. Community meetings, neighborhood meetings. It was adopted in June of 2015. What's most interesting about that to me is before June of 15, our general plan was called Concept 2010, which meant our plan for the future that you were looking at in 2010 through 15 was old, very old. I don't remember how long ago it was. It was adopted in 1992. It was a very old plan. But for what it's worth, if you are planning on staying in Nashville, Nashville Next is considered to be one of the best general plans in the country. It won an award from the American Planning Association, and it just does an incredible job of detailing how things should grow. Well, how do we implement that, though? The general plan is adopted by the Planning Commission, and everybody looks at it and goes, that's wonderful. We should do this. We should preserve all of Jolton. Does anybody even know where Jolton is? Jolton's up that way. It's up to the northwest, and it looks like you're in the mountains of East Tennessee. But it's very rural and it should stay that way. And then you look at other areas and you say, we need to concentrate development here. A lot of times it's because we want transit. If you're going to put transit, you can't have transit just going out to a bunch of rural communities because no one's going to get on it. You have to have nodes of development. And the only way you get nodes of development is by having a plan that says, here's where we're going to build. We're going to build apartments here. Look, neighbors, I know there's no apartments here today, but we're going to build apartments here so that in the future we can have some sort of transportation that isn't just adding a lane a month to the interstates. Let's see, planning for growth in Nashville. Nashville has projected the metropolitan statistical area, which is the counties around here and Nashville, by 1 million people in 25 years. Nashville itself is projected to grow by 185,000 people. So the plan is important. The plan has in it a lot of different things. It has what I call the dictionary, if you will, where it says, if people will come in and you look at a piece of land, they say, well, what's this in the plan? Well, it's T3NE. And so that doesn't mean anything to anybody. T3NE, though, means Transit Section 3, neighborhood evolving. T3 means like suburban, like Bellevue or somewhere like that. But the document that's part of Nashville Next, which is called the Community Character Manual, tells you what that means and what you can do. So you look at the whole county, if you look at it, it's this beautiful map. And all these different colors are on it. Zoom in on it, and each one will tell you, and this is in the slides, it'll tell you like what the area is. Well, then they can look at it later. And it will like tell you, here's this community, here's what it's planned for. And that's vitally important because if I have a piece of land and I come in and I want to add 20 new houses on it, so I have to rezone it because it's not zoned for it. And you come in and it says, one of the categories is called neighborhood maintenance. Well, not surprisingly, neighborhood maintenance means maintain. Don't change it. Don't add a whole lot of more houses. Don't do anything. If it's neighborhood evolving, again, it means what it sounds like. If it's something altogether different, mixed use, it just means that here's a neighborhood or a bunch of houses, but we've realized we're going to have to grow, so we're going to add some stores and apartments and other things in those areas. That's what the plan tells you. It also tells you what kind of roads you're going to have. I mean, we've got basically 3 categories of roads. You have arterial, that's Jefferson, West End, Charlotte, all the pikes that Nashville has, Whites Creek Pike, Gallatin Pike. Those are arterials. Collectors are the streets that take you to them. I imagine Johnson's is probably a collector. And then local is the rest of them. Local is the very small neighborhood streets, and then even the small ones that are downtown. Well, that's important because if you're going to put in a new gas station, not surprisingly, you can't put it on a local street, but you can put it on any of those other streets. So there's a major street plan, there's a plan for preservation, there's a plan for parks, there's a plan for housing, there's a plan for economic development. All these plans, that's why it's 1,700 pages long, are all in this one document, and it helps the city figure out how they're going to grow. Just Tuesday, the city adopted a $351 million capital budget, which means we got expenditures. So we're going to spend $350 million. In theory, it's all consistent with the plan. And I mean, it really is supposed to be reviewed to make sure it's consistent. Because again, I mean, it's just like yourself. Before you go forward with life, you got a plan. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's when I'm going to do it. And the city has to do the same thing. From a very specific standpoint, moving forward on zoning, the general plan also guides the exact zoning decisions. So the zoning ordinance, I get the process in a minute, but so what I'll say is that when you're looking at a zoning change, you review it against the general plan, you, meaning the planning department, The planning department reviews it against the general plan to decide what your zoning is going to be. So let's talk about the zoning. While the general plan is adopted by the planning commission, which is appointed by the mayor but not elected by the people, zoning is adopted by the Metro Council. For those of you who don't know, Nashville has one government for all 550-something square miles. Most other cities, you may or may not know, will have the city government in the middle, and then the county, and then lots of other little cities around it. Nashville decided in the 60s to consolidate into one government. That's why it's called the Metro Council, because it's the Metropolitan Nashville. So the Metro Council is the body that adopts the zoning. The zoning ordinance, for you, most importantly, includes those zoning districts. Remember I said it separates the use. So you have some basic categories. You have residential, mixed use, there's various commercial districts, industrial, there's also an agricultural district. But then within each of those districts, there's sub-districts. So let's say it says it's residential single family, which is RS. Some of those districts might be, you can have lots as small as 3,750 square feet. That's pretty small. That's the kind of lots you would have real close here to Fisk and in neighborhoods like Germantown. Most of East Nashville is actually a little bigger. Those are mostly 5,000 square feet. So 3,750, if you think about it, what's the math? 50, that's less than 50 by 100, because 50 by 100 would be 5,000. I mean,
so 50 by 70 lot.
That's very small. Your average lot that you think about in an urban city that has houses on it is usually 50 by 100 or 5,000 square feet. And if you care, 5,000 square feet is roughly an eighth of an acre. An acre, I have terrible numbers, but I've done planning long enough to know that an acre is 43,560 square feet. But most places here, like we talk about 40,000 square feet as being an acre. So again, you can have lot sizes. So it's residential.
Yeah, let's pause on that for just a second, because I'm thinking
pause
about,
on an acre?
Yeah, no, let's pause on the 50 by 70.
Okay.
Because I'm someone who,
you live on 50 by 70.
Well, I'm thinking like this classroom would be about 25 feet wide. And so if you put two of these together, that would be a 50-foot lot that would front the road. So the road would be going by in front of us. This would be 50. And then we'd take a couple of classrooms.
It'd be about 2 wide by 3 deep. That's more or less 50 by.
And that makes it seem pretty big, but imagine if you had like a house, normally you would have like a couple of rooms in the front that would be roughly this size, obviously a few feet more narrow. So, yeah, kind of like one of those tall skinnies that you see popping up all over the place.
Nah, that's not tall skinny.
Are they
tall
skinnier?
skinnies are like 12, 15 feet wide.
Oh, they're
No, they are, some of them. Many of them in the nation
Okay.
are 12, 15 feet wide.
You want to see tall skinnies, just go out over across to the tennis courts and look at the new white houses that were just built on those lots across the street from the tennis courts and behind the church. They are 15 feet wide by 40 feet high.
But again, who's from a big city? Somebody? There are houses that downtown everywhere that are 15 feet wide, right? I mean, now they're usually connected.
That's the difference. Like to me, I'm
and I don't know why
like
people around here decide you have to separate them, because it'd work a lot better just to have them all connected. It's a lot more environmental. It takes less money to build them.
They be having duplexes and stuff, like apartments. They look like houses, but they broken up.
Yep, you live in one, and then, people live upstairs over it and all that. So which is, again, though, why the shape matters. Nobody cares if it's 2 families or 1 family, whoever's living in there, it's what it looks like. So that's why the design is important. And it starts down at 3,750. The largest lot size, for what it's worth, is 80,000 square feet. That's about a 2-acre lot. After you get over that, they don't really, the zoning, people can just build larger if they want. Multifamily is also zoned with different, you have a multifamily district. The smallest multifamily district we have is 2 homes per acre, which is sort of weird because nobody's going to do that. You've got an acre, it's not multifamily, we have it, nobody uses it. It goes up through 100 plus is what the district reads per acre. That's a lot of houses, a lot of apartments. Some of the newest buildings in the core of downtown, I don't know if anybody's seen the 505 buildings, the tallest one sticking up downtown. that probably is over 100 units per acre. Because that lot is only like 30 or 40 feet deep. And it goes wide and it goes up 60, 45, 40, somewhere between. The developer said at one point it was going to be 75 or something, but it kind of shrank over time. So you have your zoning districts. That's what tells you what you can or can't do in the district. And what the zoning ordinance includes is zoning districts. It includes a whole huge table of land uses. Because if you're going to say, what can I do in this district, someone's got to define what it is you're doing, if that makes sense. If I'm having weddings at my house, not just my family, but if I'm going to say, hey, I'll rent my house out to you for a wedding. Does anybody think that'd be allowed in residential districts? No. But if you're in a district that has other uses, and you go down to the zoning authority, the zoning administrator, and say, I want to have weddings at my house. Well, you have to look in the code to find out what's a wedding. I mean, we know what a wedding is, but if you're going to put it in zoning, what is it? I'm trying to think, they call it events, I think, in our code. Because then the zoning administrator has to look at that use and say, well, how does it fit in this table? And that table has automobile uses, it has automobile service garages, automobile convenience, which is like 7-Eleven with a gas station, automobile sales used and automobile sales new. They're different uses. So they go in different areas, and you have light manufacturing, and there's all these different uses. And so the simplest way of explaining how the zoning works at the very base level is this land use table that's in the code. It's 9 or 10 pages long. And in your matrix, up and down, you've got the zoning districts. And going this way, you have land uses. And they're all categorized. There's residential, commercial, entertainment. I mean, there's driving ranges are listed as a use. Cemeteries are listed as a use. Waste transfer plants are listed. Cell towers, all these things are listed. So then you go across the table, and it's got letters in it. So if it says single family home over here, you go through, and it's in residential, it's in all these others. Believe it or not, it used to not be in the downtown zoning. You couldn't have a single family home downtown. They fixed that, because why not? There's a family that I know that there's a bank down on 3rd Avenue, 3rd, right in front near the courthouse. That's their home. There's an old bank about a block from the courthouse, and they bought the bank, and that's where they live. Their extended family lives right there in that bank. And I remember when I was working at Metro, the guy that's in charge of those decisions came down and we talked about it. He goes, they just want to live there. It says they can't. And we just agree that's stupid. I mean, why not? So he kind of turned a blind eye to it. So you got your table, and that tells you what you can do and how you can do it. So that's sort of the basic. If most people care about zoning, that's it right there. Zoning districts, land uses. Yes?
I just have a question about that.
Please.
They turned into a house. So it's like just a house or it's apartments?
I haven't been in it. They have receptions in the lobby, the bank. And I think they just like the offices turned into, it's a large family. Okay. It's an immigrant family, large extended family. Okay. And with money, obviously. You don't buy a downtown bank without money. Division Street, the Choi family. And so, they got a bank now. They have receptions and stuff. They don't waste it. They occasionally will have, if they're part of some organization and they want to have a reception, they use the lobby part for it. But that's what that zoning table tells you. Because if someone, again, that Harley repair shop I was talking about, if I live in a mixed use zone, I can probably do that. Here's a good example of a zoning district that I've had to work in, but it also helps you kind of think this through. Most of y'all know Germantown, where it is. There's 5th Avenue in Germantown, runs right off, you go right off Jefferson, and there's a little place called Germantown Cafe, there's a red bike and all these other, there's this whole street with a lot of cool old looking houses. Some of them aren't old, by the way, they were built about 20 years ago, but they're all made to look old. That zoning, you would look at it and say, I bet that's all single family residential. Well, it's not, it's mixed use. If you want to take any one of those houses and turn it into a hat store,
Restaurant?
Maybe, yeah, usually a restaurant. I mean, it's a mix, it's called mixed use limited. That's what the zoning is. So in more urban areas, that's what we allow. You look at that table, you go all the way across. It isn't going to say like fast food. It says restaurant, comma, fast food. It's not allowed over there because it's more, they don't want, let's say Chick-fil-A, which just opened on Church Street yesterday. They don't want, you know, a little fast food place open up in one of these type neighborhoods. You know, car dealers, none of those are allowed in there, but a lot of things are.
Oh, you said a new Chick-fil-A over there?
Yeah.
You talking about right by Bank of America?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No dining room though.
Huh?
None.
So what is this drive-through?
Nope, no drive-through.
We just walk up to the window?
You walk up, or it's catering. It's the cater stuff downtown mostly. You can still walk up though. And you know what else there's no, while you're at it? No cash.
It ain't no cash?
It's a no cash store.
They take Apple Pay?
I don't know that much. Come on, I knew more than you think I'd know about a Chick-fil-A. But actually, drive-through is a good example. I don't know if you could do a drive-through right there downtown on Church Street. I sure hope not, because you don't want to be clogging Church Street with a bunch of cars backed up in the drive-through. It's bad enough every Starbucks in town that's blocking, you know, West End. And that's another example of zoning in ways you may not think about. A lot of cities have said no more drive-throughs. And that's not a use, that's just a part of how the buildings are used. Because they generate carbon dioxide, because you're sitting there with the car idling, unless you have one of those new cars that turns itself off. But, you're generating that, and you're also encouraging people to drive. Go to your local coffee shop. There's a new one right here, isn't there? Right, there's one.
Yeah, it's a Starbucks. It's right
No,
over
there's a
on
new
Charlotte.
one in Jefferson Street because they got in trouble
Or my
for
office.
appropriating a name.
I have Starbucks in my office.
All right, so zoning districts. But the code has more things than just uses and the districts are important. It tells you the uses, but it also tells you something else called bulk regulations. The bulk regulations are, okay, we got this piece of property. We've told you can put, let's say a duplex, because there's single family, but there's also, in Nashville anyway, single and two family zoning. So let's say you can put a duplex up. Does everybody know what a duplex is? Two families. Nashville, ironically, has something we call a detached duplex, which to me is oxymoron. It can't be any such thing. But it's just two houses on one lot. That's what you see all over the place around here. And you can sell both those houses, but they call it a duplex. So you get this piece of property, you look at the code, can I build a duplex? Yes. All right. How close can I put it to the street? That's what the bulk regulations are. How tall can it be? How far on the sides? There's something called ISR, impervious surface ratio. Impervious is building and driveways and everything else. So like
The water won't soak.
Yeah, so if you have a big old lot, and again, in the core of downtown, you can cover the whole thing. In other parts of town, you may not be able to cover more than 75% because they want grass and stuff so water can go through it. And now we will build lots of parking lots, you know, that have that pervious pavement that the water runs through. So that's what the bulk regulations tell you. How tall, for what it's worth, single family can be 3 stories tall. And if any of you want to be lawyers, you would love this kind of thing, because what's 3 stories? What's 3 stories? How many feet?
Chocolate.
It could be. It's 3 different floors. Yeah. How many feet high is 3 stories? No, I mean, that's the point. Nobody knows. It doesn't tell you anything to just say it's 3 stories, unless code tells you, which it does, what a maximum of height is for each story. And it also doesn't tell you is if I do 3 floors, so I look at the building, windows, 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 that's 3 stories, and then they got a rooftop deck. Well, that doesn't count. Code says that's not a floor because it's up there. Codes also will say, you know what a mezzanine is? That's kind of halfway between floors. Like if you've got a floor and then a floor comes out halfway with like a balcony on it overlooking, that's a mezzanine. Sometimes they don't count that as a floor. So you can get a really tall 3-story building. And there's a guy that Love Circle over off West End built this hideous thing called Mount Richmore.
From Big and Rich. Right?
Yes, John Rich of calls it, and he has big Klieg lights telling the neighbors to go away. But it's just huge, because he found someone who could go every loophole and get it taller and taller. Point being, there's all these details in the code. Just like any other kind of code, you can find ways around things or look them up. So there's bulk regulations, there's land use. If you look at that table I said that has P in certain places, it might also say PC, which doesn't mean politically correct. It means permitted with certain conditions. So if you want to do a restaurant in the mixed use neighborhood district, yeah, you can do that, but it has to be closed by 9 o'clock. Or, yeah, you can do that, but it can only seat 20 people. We don't want, a huge restaurant, or something like that. So PC, special conditions. I'm not even going to talk about special exceptions, because they are a special exception. There's also accessory uses. Accessory is important because everybody knows about Airbnb. And if I have a house, and our zoning administrator, who's the guy that decides what is and isn't legal, has said that an Airbnb is an accessory use. That means you have to have a primary use. So if I just buy a piece of property, this isn't actually legally correct, but let's pretend it is. If I just buy a piece of property and say, I'm just going to run this as an Airbnb, you can't unless you're primary something else. In other words, what is it primarily? Well, it's a single family house. That group I told you about that had the family that had the garage, they wanted to know, well, if we own the house, can we just rent out the garage as an Airbnb? Again, the answer is no, because the zoning only allows one house. If the zoning allowed 2 houses, absolutely, because you've got your building and you can use that as an accessory. Another easy thing to think about an accessory is a garage. If you've zoned this property for a house, that's the use. Believe it or not, if you have a lot that's zoned only for a house, you can't just put a garage on it. And by garage, I mean, a home garage, a residential garage. Garage has to be an accessory to another use. There's other things. There is an in-law apartment. If I live in a house that's zoned only for single family, so it's not a duplex, can't have 2 families, but I can have my in-laws live in a separate apartment. So it's kind of like 2 families, but the code says you have to have a door inside. They can't be made to go outside. So it's got all these details in it, and those are the bulk regulations that detail those different things. Accessory, permitted with conditions. So you got all your regular districts, residential, mixed use, industrial. Now you also have a lot of special districts. Some of the special districts, has anybody ever heard of a planned unit development or a PUD? Planned unit development is what it sounds like. It's planned, and it's taking a piece of property, and you've got to have a plan for it. Here's where this building's going to go. Here's where this building's going to go. Here's how we're going to use all these. It just takes a plan and puts it on top of the zoning. I'm not going to say anything else about that. Urban design overlay. There are overlays. Again, we've got our residential neighborhood. It's all zoned R something for residential only. And like I said, the bulk regulations say 3 stories, how many feet from the sides. But somebody decides that they want it to be designed a certain way. They want all the houses or let's make it multifamily so you can have some apartment buildings. They don't just want apartment buildings that are sitting on the street with no stoops, no doors, no nothing. And again, maybe parking lots in front of it. So they adopt a design overlay. None of that other stuff changes. You can still have the same height, you can still have the same setback, but it might say you've got to build it up to the street. And you've got to have doors on the street because, you know how much nicer a street is when you've got people going in and out on it rather than just this deserted 5 blocks that you're walking without anybody there. So design overlays go on top. There's overlays that go on top of zoning. There are other overlays. It's probably getting into the weeds, but so I'm not going to go into them. Let me briefly talk about what Nashville has done. Frankly, with pretty much all of its zoning. You go into the planning department now, got a piece of property. I want to rezone it, put mixed-use building. I want to put a little market on the first floor and apartments over it. More likely than not, they're going to look at that Nashville Next community plan. They're going to look at it, and somewhere down it's going to say a design plan should be used for any rezoning because they don't really like any of that just plain old mixed-use zoning or that other zoning because it's too simple. And they're worried about what things are going to look like. So they'll say you have to do a design-based zoning, and what we have now in Nashville for the past 15, 20 years is called specific plan, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a specific plan. And it really, all that stuff I just told you about, the bulk regulations, the setbacks, all the uses, throw it all out the window. It's all right there in that document that gets approved by the council. It's kind of good because you can meet with the neighborhood and say, here's exactly what it's going to be. And if you're the owner, you know exactly what you're going to be able to build. And the council member knows exactly what it's going to be. But it's also kind of bad because you've got this whole zoning code with all these tables in it. And you look at this piece of property, you move in the neighborhood, and you say, oh, that's zoned SP. It doesn't tell you anything. I mean, it doesn't tell you anything at all. You've got to go pull up the SP, and it could be 30 pages long. But it's just where we are today as a city. Everything is getting zoned one parcel or one area at a time with specific plans. Let's see. The tables, single, two-family. So you've got your piece of property, and you know it's zoned. And it's zoned, again, we'll say multifamily. But I'm looking at this, I want to build 40 units. And there's this guy over here, he's got 50 acres. I don't need 50 acres to build one little old 40-unit apartment building. So what I have to do is subdivide the property. And Metro and every city, every community has subdivision regulations. So by subdivide, it means if I've got 40 acres and all I want's 10, essentially you take that, if that's 40 acres, you draw that, and that's your 10 acres. Well, under the law in Tennessee, well, 10 acres you could do. Again, ignore that detail. Technically in Tennessee, if it's more than 5 acres, you don't have to do a subdivision plat. So let's say it's 4 acres then. You're doing a 4-acre lot. You have to do what's known as a subdivision plat. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a subdivision plat, but it is a map of the property, has all kinds of notes on it. Let's see, now I got it. Slide. It has all kinds of notes on it. Again, it lays out like what the zoning is, where stormwater is going to go, and those kind of things. It's a legal document that allows you to buy those 5 acres. Technically, if you have somebody and you say, hey, you've got this lot, it's 2 acres, and I want to buy 1 acre, you can't. It's actually a misdemeanor to buy that 1 acre without first recording a subdivision plat. I don't know if anybody's ever been prosecuted for an illegal subdivision, but what it does make a difference is if you buy that 1 acre lot from your friend, you don't subdivide it, and then you go to the bank. Say, hey, I want to borrow $100,000, $150,000 to build a house. The bank's going to look at it. They're going to find out it wasn't legally created. It's not a legal lot, and you're not going to get your money because it's not a legal lot. They're afraid they can't sell it if they foreclose, that kind of thing.
Or you're going to go to the city for your building permit, and they're going to say, well, we're not going to give you a building permit because that's not a legal lot. And so that subdivision requirement kind of goes back to the whole idea of, you know, kind of the police power and kind of government trying to look out for the public good, trying to plan. If somebody's got like a 50-acre lot that they want to break into small ones, well, the city or the village wants to make sure that they can provide water, sewer, electric, gas to all of those new lots, and so they want the right to approve the subdivision. If that makes sense. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to let them know they're on slide 37.
Oh, thank you. Well, we're way past here, but I wanted to show this to you. I mean, you saw those maps fly by. There's a lot of this in the community plan. This just, I mean, in the Nashville Next general plan. This is all the community plans in Nashville. And one of the things I like about it is we used to call them sub-area plans. And so if you came in, they'd say, well, you live in sub-area 13. And that doesn't mean anything to anybody. So now planning has renamed them to give them names that at least have something to do with the city, where if you lived here permanently, you would know all these different areas. So each of these, though, has a separate plan that has all the details about that community. Okay.
Which is part of the reason why
Can you go back one?
1,700 pages long.
That is we're here. We're somewhere around here. There's DD time, so we're right over there. But that's the community plan for what's called the North Nashville Community Plan. And again, it's just the point is Each one of these, that's those, what I said, T3 and E, all those land use districts. Each one of these different colors is a different policy area. That's not zoning. These are the policies. The zoning is, I don't have a zoning map because it's it's much smaller than that. Now let's get where we are. Nope, more. Why? I can listen while he goes forward.
Oh, the
No,
question.
go ahead.
Okay, so, you know, like when you vote for stuff,
Stop that.
like if you vote for the mayor, you have to live like a certain place. And you know how like, you said when you do like a 2-person or like 1 person, do y'all ever get in trouble with that? Like for like the people who are over the politics, if they're like, well, 2 people live there and compared to like somewhere else for like voting?
For how many people can vote or for who can vote?
Or for who can vote in that area, and then how many people are in that area compared to other areas?
They measure that. That's actually, you mean to measure the total population, how they measure it by houses?
Mm-hmm.
No, they don't do that with zoning typically. Zoning just tells you what you could do. They usually use census numbers to tell exactly who lives where.
Wait, so is this different than like zoning for like schools or something?
Yes. Because zoning, I see what you're saying. When you're zoning, right, this is different. A school zone says if you can go to that school, or a school district or a political district says I can vote for Brenda Gilmore who's running for state senate, or I can vote for Jeff Yarborough who's also running for state senate. That tells you the districts, and if there's 5 people or 100 people, it doesn't matter, but they do count the people to decide what size the districts are going to be. My wife actually works in that. But so this is that table I was telling you about. These are all your Can the pointer still work?
So these zones are.
I don't want
really
to touch it. I'll probably
related
mess it up.
to
Let's not mess it up.
What kind of
it's
use
not gonna-
you can make of a certain piece of property in terms of what can you build on it, what can you operate on it? Like what can you build on it and what you can do there.
So
It
let's-
could be overlaid with those other zones that you're talking about theoretically, but it's just not. Like the government looks at those different types of zones and districts completely differently.
Okay.
So again, these are all the uses, and there's 6 of these pages. So let's say that you wanted to do a monastery. You've always wanted to open a monastery, and so you look around town for
Seems
different.
harmless,
I mean,
right?
why not?
Yeah.
Or a convent. And so you look at different land. You look somewhere and you go, well, my land's zone RS 80. Can I do a convent or a monastery? Unfortunately, no. But not surprisingly, mixed use, multifamily, all those others, you can do one. That's what this table is for. This is a very useful table for anyone that says, what can I do on my property? That's what this table tells you. We're way past here.
So I thought daycare center was another interesting one. Some people have home businesses with daycare centers. Can you do it in the zone that you live in?
Let's stop here for a second. The bulk regulations that I talked about, that each piece of land, setbacks and all that, that's just one. These tables, there's hundreds of these in the zoning ordinance. This is the zoning ordinance. So again, if I own a piece of land at zone RS10, that means 10,000 square feet is what those numbers mean, by the way. So you can't be smaller than 10,000 square feet. So that column's really not necessary, but that's what that says. Building coverage, 0.4. So if you've got a 10,000 square foot lot, you cannot build a house that has 5,000 square feet on the first floor. You also don't need to build a house that has 5,000 square feet on the first floor. Nobody does. But setback, you have to be 20 feet from that back property line, so you can't be right up on your neighbor behind you. And side setback, 5 feet. You have to have that much space beside you. And if you think about it, a lot of that stuff makes sense. You need to be able to get, AT&T trucks or whatever, because there's lines behind the houses, that kind of thing. Maximum height 3 stories. Parking is another table that's in there, how much parking you have to have for everything. We talked about subdivision. We were on subdivision regulations. I'm done with that. Don't end my show. Briefly, the point of this slide, and this is that there's a limit on what subdivision regulations are supposed to do. You've got your zoning, and this is an issue near and dear to my heart because I had the Planning Commission turn me down on a subdivision recently. where they said that they didn't want that many houses on the property. Well, zoning, remember that's what it says. How many houses, what size lots do I have to have? The subdivision regulations technically don't say how many houses you can have on a piece of property. Again, that's zoning. 40,000 square feet, and you've got 10,000 square foot lot size, you can have 4 houses. Because 10,000 divided by 4, 40,000 is 10. But this is what it does say, is, I mean, it really, the subdivision regulations are to figure out how it should all be laid out. That's really what it says. And you can go on to the next one. Zoning process. So we've got our zoning regulations, we've got our general plan. You want to rezone your piece of property.
So should we back up just a second to what you were saying way at the beginning? How the zoning ordinance is something, like the plan of Nashville Next, for example, was adopted by the Planning Commission, which is that body of people appointed by the mayor. The zoning code was adopted by the Metro Council.
It's law. The plan
That's
is
law.
not law.
That's what says, that's what covers the entire city and says, you know, these areas are zoned like RS, these are zoned mixed use, these are zoned industrial, et cetera. Then you look at the table and see what you can do in those zones. Now David's talking about, what if you're a property owner and you want to change your zoning so that it's different than what the council originally laid out?
What we see all the time is a piece of property that is zoned for single family, and one of our clients wants to rezone it because they want to build 140, 250, or some number of affordable housing apartments. So let's say that's the subject. We got a 10-acre piece of land, and a client wants to build 140 affordable units. First thing you do is you go to the planning department. That's where you file an application. They will take your application and probably say, you know, first they'll tell you, do you have a shot at this? Are you, you know, does this area only allow single family? Then don't waste your time, unless you got the councilman in your pocket. But don't waste your time because you're not going to get it done. So the planning department takes your application, and let me go back to this. The process, this process is different all around the country. In some parts of the country, again, California, parts of urban Virginia are famous, like Arlington and Alexandria, for taking forever. If you want to build that apartment building, it might take you 2 years to get the land zoned, because you got to go through all sorts of extra review levels that you don't have to here. Here, they'll say that it takes you about 6 weeks to get through the planning commission. That's not true, it takes longer. But it's probably even about 4 to 6 months to get a piece of land from one type of zoning to another zoning. And I also will back up and say, well, I said file your application with the planning department. It's just not that you're getting ready to go rezone something, but you really, the first thing somebody wants to do is go talk to the council member. Mentioned Metro Council in Nashville. This is especially true because Nashville has 35 districts, the second largest city council in the country, Chicago being the first. And what it means, you don't think about it, in 35 districts it is, they're very close to their constituents. I was elected by a whopping like 1,200 people. I mean, it's not that, there's just not that many people involved, and so they're all showing up at meetings. And when the zoning happens, the council member pretty much completely controls it. So you want to meet with the council member, but technically you go to the planning department. Straight zoning, if you're just going from single family to multifamily to allow 10 units, 15 units per acre, that should be pretty simple. All the agencies look at it. They don't really have anything to look at because you're not drawing up a plan. But agents by agencies, I mean, your stormwater, those are the guys that worry about where the water runs off, water and sewer, pretty obvious. Public Works does streets, sidewalks, and garbage collection, those kind of things. So all those agencies take that application and they tell the planning department, here's what we think is good, here's what we think is bad. Eventually, you have signs not posted, you have a public hearing at the planning commission. So what's the planning commission do? That's the next page, I guess. That's a staff report they prepare. Next one real quick. Staff reports can be 150 pages long. Planning commission meets twice a month. Let me explain what the planning commission does. You got a planning department. Those are the staff people. They're just hired like anybody else. They work for the planning commission. Planning commission is appointed by the mayor. Their job is to take a zoning application, and after planning staff says approved with conditions, the commission is the one that makes that decision. They can completely ignore the staff, of course, if they want to. The planning commission will review and let's say, well, I don't remember, this was rezoned to SP, but again, our example is going to be multifamily. It said, you know, planning commission says, we're going to rezone it to multifamily. They ask to rezone it to multifamily. Your planning commission says, no, terrible idea, and they disapprove it. That doesn't kill it in Tennessee, I mean Nashville especially. The planning commission is only making a recommendation on zoning. Remember, who can tell me who does zoning? Is it the planning commission or the council? So all the planning commission is doing is making a recommendation. The council is the one that's going to make that final decision. Can't remember where it was, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it real briefly now. In some states, Florida especially, you can't rezone something contrary to what the general plan says. General plan says that that area is supposed to stay single family. The planning commission says whatever they say, because who cares, because they're just making a recommendation. But the council comes in and says, we're going to approve this for multifamily, even though the general plan says it can't be. In Florida, you can't do that. That's an illegal zoning. You can go to court and win. Here, the courts have said, no, don't care. The plan doesn't control. The council controls it completely. If the planning commission, though, makes a recommendation to disapprove something, the council has to have 27 votes, which is 2/3 of the majority instead of just a simple majority, before they can approve it. So it does have an effect. Next. As I said, that's what I just talked about. I guess they make a recommendation. And planning commission votes on it. You have a huge public hearing. Everybody turns out and yells and screams. Nobody ever turns out in support of anything. Everybody likes to come and complain, but nobody likes to come and... If you see a group of people supporting it, they probably own it. But you have your opposition and your supporters. Planning commission makes whatever decision they make. In theory, your planning commission is really just supposed to be looking at the general plan and saying, yes, this is consistent, or no, it's not consistent, or yes, if you add, 100 more trees, we'll love it. They go off on tangents too. I mean, if they have a whole lot of people show up and say we're opposed to it, it doesn't matter what the general plan says, they'll probably recommend disapproval. But after that's done, you don't have zoning, do you? Because the planning commission doesn't zone. Is that right? Yes, the planning commission doesn't zone. Council zone. So you got to file an ordinance with the council. Because what you're doing, sorry to back up a second, the zoning ordinance includes all that stuff I said, zoning districts. It also includes a map. That map is part of the ordinance. And it says that we right now are standing in what I'm going to guess is mixed-use zoning, where it says that our property we've talked about is single-family zoning. That map has lines drawn on it. It's all computerized now. It used to be an actual paper map. But it says that's what the zoning is. So when you want to change that zoning, you literally are changing what that map says from residential, single-family, to multifamily, or to whatever else your zoning is. So you're filing an ordinance, and that ordinance will actually say to change the official zoning map from whatever to whatever. That gets filed, just briefly, it gets filed. There's 3 readings. That's pretty much the case with the legislature, and I think even Congress. Does Congress have 3? Do you know? A lot of legislative bodies have what's called 3 readings.
I think it does.
The purpose is you got to introduce the thing, get it before everybody. Second reading is often a public hearing. For zoning, it's definitely a public hearing. Again, same thing happens. You have a public hearing at the council. Really bored someday, look up Metros online, because I know none of you have regular TVs anymore. The community access television, or actually they have a YouTube channel now. The council and planning commission have the YouTube channel. Seriously, if you're all interested, just Google Planning Commission, Metro Nashville, or Metro Council public hearings. Sometimes they're kind of funny. There was a bad zoning. There was a bad zoning in East Nashville, and a songwriter showed up, and he spent you got 2 minutes of time, he sang an original song that he wrote in opposition to the zoning, which was really just great, about how you're ruining my neighborhood, and you're letting this in, we shouldn't have this. So, it's public hearings, it's Nashville.
It was a country song, wasn't it?
It definitely was a country song.
Yeah, gotta complain, it's gotta be country.
Or Nashville, that too. Public hearing, second reading. Oh, introduction, first reading. Just because to have a little fun, usually nothing happens at that. Probably 30 years ago, however, a councilman introduced a bill to zone a piece of land for a UFO landing pad. He was absolutely serious that we had to have a UFO landing pad in Nashville. The council didn't approve that on first reading. They withdrew. They said, we're getting rid of that. We don't want to be the laughing stock of the country. But so usually though, unless you're getting a UFO landing pad or something that's just outrageously illegal, it goes through public hearing and then you vote on it a third time. After it's signed by the mayor, there's a mapping division of Nashville that actually changes it on the map. So you have your new zoning. Next slide, please. Subdivisions. Again, this is not done by the council. Matter of fact, the council can't change it at all. This is 100% planning commission. I'm not going to go through the details. It's the same thing as I said earlier. This is how you take a piece of land and create separate pieces of land. The final subdivision plat is the one that gets recorded with the register of deeds and actually creates the new legal lot. And then if you're going to build your apartment building, you've got it rezoned, you've got your subdivision plat, and then you go pull a permit. It's that easy, right, Hannah? Mm-hmm. Most of our people, it takes us months and months to deal with, but it's really that easy. Mm-hmm. That's not that easy. Because you're trying to pull that permit, they're going to say it's not consistent. You don't want to go into that part. We're doing zoning. Next. Thank you. So, you asked to rezone your property multifamily, and it met the community plan. The community plan said, hey, you should have multifamily on that corner. And the council says, you know, I don't care. We had 100 people show up, all of whom voted for me last time and are going to vote for me next time. We're not going to approve this. So they voted down. So you said, well, you know, there's got to be a way I can appeal this. And the technical answer, if your zoning is passed or doesn't get passed, or let's say you opposed it and it got passed, either way, you want to appeal what happened, technically you can go to the courts. For a zoning decision, there's other appeals I'm going to talk about in a second where you might have a shot. For a zoning decision, unless it's completely illegal, it isn't going to get reversed. The most recent one I can think of in Nashville, the council tried to rezone a piece of property to prohibit a children's home of some kind, I think a halfway house, and even made the mistake of standing up and saying that's what they were doing. I mean, you could at least make up a reason. But that's a violation of equal housing laws. I don't know if it ever got to court, but it was settled, and they paid lots of money to the people that they downzoned the property. So, I mean, yeah, you would have won that one in court. But otherwise, what the courts have said, I'm actually quoting a decision here, if there's a rational or justifiable basis for the enactment and it doesn't violate any state statute or positive constitutional guarantee, the wisdom of the zoning regulation is a matter exclusively for legislative determination. Now, if we know anything about government, we know separation of powers. And what the courts are saying is that it's a legislative decision how land is zoned and how land's going to be used. And as long as it's not violating the Constitution or a state statute, then we're not going to get in the way. We're not going to second guess. Next. Now, there are other appeals. The Board of Zoning Appeals does not do what it sounds like. You don't appeal your zoning to the Board of Zoning Appeals. The Zoning Appeals Board is set up, established by state law, and a variance is the primary thing they do. Anybody have a clue what a variance is? Just out of curiosity. A variance is if my property says, if it says, height variances are asked for all the time. This is one actually being requested at the street behind me, as a matter of fact. Our zoning laws in Nashville currently say that if you build a garage behind your house, it can only be 1.5 stories tall. Even if the house can be 3 stories, but you can't build a 3-story garage. So the guy that lives a block or two over from me has asked the Board of Zoning Appeals to grant him a variance to vary. You have a law that says 1.5 stories, and he's asking to vary that law so that he can build his garage 2 stories. He technically, by the way, he probably intends to rent it as an Airbnb, which would be illegal because he can only have one family He doesn't have the zoning for it, but, and I'm not gonna get involved with it, I just don't care that much. But he's asking for a variance from the law. So that's what the Board of Zoning Appeals does. Now, the Board of Zoning Appeals doesn't get to go, well, that's a nice looking garage. I mean, if it was ugly, it'd be one thing. But we're gonna let him do it because it's a beautiful garage. That's not what the Board of Zoning Appeals authority is. Their authority is extremely limited, just like the courts are for zoning decisions. They can grant a variance if, by reason of exceptional narrowness, shallowness, or shape, or by reason of exceptional topographic conditions or other extraordinary and exceptional situation condition, the property would result in a peculiar and exceptional practical difficulties or undue hardship. I think I said it twice. To the owner. It has to, if there's no reason I can think of you have to build a taller one. But I have seen some where, let's say the setback says you have to be 20 feet from this property line, and there's a cliff on the other side of the property. The Board of Zoning Appeals, that is an exceptional topographic condition, because you've got a weird piece of property. So we'll let you move that thing over. We will, the zoning says, no, you can't be 5 feet from the property line, but the Board of Zoning Appeals has the authority to say, that's fine, it's cool, you can do that. Just as something I'm actually working on right now, there's a piece of property on Barnes Road in Antioch where the Board of Zoning Appeals granted a sidewalk variance. Supposed to build a sidewalk along this huge natural gas compressing plant, if you're familiar with that. And it's this huge plant in the middle of a residential neighborhood that shouldn't be allowed, but the state, again, stepped in and told Nashville they couldn't prevent it out there. And the Board of Zoning Appeals was so excited that these people were willing to pay $400,000 to the government for sidewalks to be built elsewhere that they approved the variance. Well, there is nothing, having just written a whole brief about it, there's nothing exceptional, extraordinary, peculiar, or practical that prevents them from building a sidewalk. They had no legal authority to grant a variance, and yet they granted it. We'll see if the courts agree with me, but so we filed that. I didn't actually file it. I don't like filing lawsuits anymore. I'm working with somebody else. Board of Zoning Appeals, variances, appeal decision. Oh, again, you go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. You ask for your variance. You say, I want to build my garage 2 stories tall. The Board of Zoning Appeals says no. Well, let's say this. The Board of Zoning Appeals says yes. Neighborhood Association says, no, you can't just grant that variance because you thought it was a pretty garage. They can appeal also to the courts. You can see a lot, there's a theme here of deference. Courts defer to the council, the Board of Zoning Appeals, but here, the court, if the Board of Zoning Appeals granted a variance, and this is, I just thought of this, and that's why it's in here, is that variance I just said about the sidewalk, I could very well lose, because even though they didn't have any basis, the courts are only going to reverse the Board of Zoning Appeals if they, what it says here, followed an unlawful procedure, acted illegally, arbitrarily, or fraudulently, or without material evidence to support its decision. Obviously, that right there is what I'm going on, that they didn't have any evidence. A good example of a case where the court was happy to reverse a zoning variance here, somebody was asking a part of town to build a quarry in the not far from a residential area, and it was completely legal, everything met the law. The Board of Zoning Appeals said, I know it meets the law. I mean, they literally said on the record, bad idea. I know it meets the law. There's no reason we have to disapprove it, but I'm still going to vote to disapprove it. Well, that would be arbitrary, if ever there was arbitrary. So the court reversed that. Next, please.
Do you have 10 minutes?
Yes, and I'm right on schedule. 3, 4. So, actually a little ahead. Another thing the Board of Zoning Appeals does. Remember the land use table, and I said there's this guy, it has been a guy, but a person in Metro who makes that determination. It's the same anywhere in the state, pretty much anywhere in the country. You have someone who here is called the zoning administrator. If you think about it, remember our wedding, and I said you got to take, someone has to say, is that okay? Because I'm going down to pull a business permit, or let's say a building permit to add a gazebo in the backyard. And I want to add that, and they said, what are you going to do? I said, well, we're going to have weddings. And someone has to say, is that okay or not okay? And that person is the zoning administrator. The zoning administrator gets appealed a lot. But his decisions are appealed to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and they review them. They don't actually defer to him. They review it. They defer to him because they know him, and they know he's been doing this a long time, and he understands the stuff. There's no legal reason that they have to accept what he has said. Just, again, as an interesting point, right now, if you look at a Board of Zoning Appeals agenda, half of them are people asking not to build sidewalks, because developers now have to build sidewalks almost all the time. The other half are people who illegally operated Airbnbs and are being hauled in by the zoning people saying you can't do that, or the neighborhood. And the Board of Zoning Appeals has Airbnb and sidewalk variance. That's all they do now. As with any other Board of Zoning Appeals decision, it can be appealed to the courts. Our subdivisions, again, Planning Commission does these. In some areas, I frankly don't know how this works, but I know they do it in Knoxville. If your subdivision is disapproved, you can appeal to the council. I'm not convinced why that's legal, but again, I haven't gotten into it because I haven't had to. Here, in most areas in Tennessee and probably the country, again, subdivision is a planning commission decision. It's a pretty technical decision. It's quasi-judicial typically. You again can appeal to the courts, and again, the courts are going to defer. If the planning commission said, we think your 10 lots are too many for this piece of property, even though the zoning allows it, unless it's really bad, the courts are probably going to defer to it. I'm hesitating because we have a plat recently where we asked for 5 lots and we're suing. So we'll see what happens. Or the owner is suing. That's the end of the slides. Seeing if I've left things out because of the others.
Did you guys have any questions?
Surely somebody has a question about, like, who can do what next to me? Or can I have a party in my house? Because, yeah, that's just a single time thing. Yeah.
So, when people go to Airbnbs and stuff like that, you said it has to be like a single house. So, like, people can, a single family. So, people can't do Airbnbs like this. That is legal.
Actually, no. You just have to have I use single family as an example. You have to have if your property was zoned for a factory only, you couldn't do an Airbnb because there's no residence there. Any type of zoning that allows residences in certain situations can have an Airbnb. Multifamily, if you really right now, if you have a 20-unit apartment building, it's a good idea, next time you rent an apartment, it's a good idea to take a look at the lease and ask if other people can make their units into Airbnbs, because there are people in town who are living in apartment buildings and then found out that the company that owns it has decided to rent out 10 of them as Airbnbs. 505 building, somebody said they knew where that building was. The huge one downtown, there's a company that I happen to represent that has 125 Airbnb units in that building. And if I bought a unit in there, and they like run in the millions, so I'd really want to know this, I'd want to know that people are using, some of the units in that building are going to be, bachelorette parties and all that. But the point, you can do them in multifamily. In single family neighborhoods, there's a certain percentage. They've got the whole area done by census district. And if somebody wanted to do one, they go online and they look. And if there's too many Airbnbs already in that district, you can't get a license for one or a permit. But in other places you can. So Germantown, you're never going to get a permit. Nations, a lot of these areas that are a lot of Airbnbs, you're never going to get a permit, which is why there's so many illegal operating ones.
But so you were saying that with a single family, also to get a permit, it has to be an accessory use. So
no, it can be an accessory. I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Oh, okay.
If we have, maybe I kind of played fast and loose. If you got a single family home, you can have what's called an owner occupied. And actually, I just said you have to have a certain percentage. That's if you're not living there. If I live in my house Anywhere in Nashville right now, there's no limit. I can get a permit to allow people to stay with me. I have a friend who lives over on a street called Maxwell in East Nashville. He has people in probably 4 nights a week, and just they live in his house. I mean, he has his bedroom and bathroom, and there's a bedroom, living room, and they walk through his house to get to the bathroom in the hallway. I don't know about you, that's not my thing. I don't want a bunch of strangers from Europe, and they're all from all over the place that come and stay. He likes that. He likes having a glass of wine with them and talking with them. But the point is, it's 100% legal. As long as you're owner occupied, anyone in Nashville can do it. If you have a house and it's zoned, what you can't do is, like a lot of these houses, is buy it and then only rent it out as an Airbnb. Don't think of any exciting war story, but I can't think of any. If you're ever interested, want to know about zoning, you've got our contact information on the slides. And seriously, if you got anybody that asks, I'll talk all day about zoning. Doesn't matter. I know it sounds boring, but I think it's interesting because it's how we live. You don't think about it, but next time you drive by something and you wonder, is that legal? Why is that there? Or is that okay? There's a lot of things that were in place before zoning that may not be good now, but they were there before we had a zoning law. And we can go into grandfathered uses, but let's not. What we do on zoning is when we're getting ready to close on a loan, and I don't do that part, that's what Hannah and other people do, is you'll have a piece of property and you'll send a surveyor out to take a look at it. And the surveyor will say, well, this property isn't zoned for all these units. And so we have to figure out why. Usually it is, because usually it's already there. But we have to figure out, does the zoning allow what our clients want to build? We don't usually rezone it, mostly because our clients build affordable housing, and a lot of people don't like having, if you come in and say, hey, we're going to build a bunch of affordable apartments behind you, a lot of people don't jump up and down. They should. It's frankly really nice housing. I guarantee you have no idea where our clients are going to build housing in Nashville. It's called tax credit housing. If anybody knows where Woodland Street is, there's a park right there, right across the street from it. It's this beautiful 4-story apartment building. It's all for people that make 60% of the median income or less. The building at Wedgwood and 12th right now is currently under construction. Some of those apartments are 50 and 40% of a median income or less. So there's all kinds of I'm trying to think if there's one right around here. There's a property called Hallmark at Fisk, but I don't know where it is.
I think MDHA has 10th and Jefferson.
Oh yeah, we should be that offensively named bail bond company. Yeah, so and another, there's a lot of interesting, nice apartments. If you've got any other questions for us later, we're here. Are they allowed to go early?
You are released.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll have to do it. Thank you. I can talk, you know that. Talking is not an issue.
And I'm sorry I did not figure out what was wrong with the computer earlier.
But you know what's great for me?
You know what it
I have an
was?
excuse for any rambling. If I just rambled with it, I wouldn't have an excuse.
It was simply overheating.
It was what?
Overheating.
Oh,